Hello again. In this activity, we're going to learn about the people who inhabited the land that we now call West Virginia. At the end of this activity, you will be adding labels to the 5 periods of time marked on a timeline.
Like the world around it, West Virginia has changed over the years. The state was created on June 20th, 1863 during the Civil War. Have you ever wondered what the area was like before it became a state? Let's look back into history to see who was here before West Virginia existed. The Mound Builders. Some of the earliest people to leave evidence that they were here are the Mound Builders. These people lived during a period that archaeologists call the Adena period, 500 BC to 200 BC. People from this period were hunters and gatherers. Much of what we know about them comes from studying the mounds that they built. They used the mounds to bury important people like chiefs. Hundreds of mounds are scattered across West Virginia, mainly around Kanawha, Ohio, and Potomac River valleys. The largest mound like this in North America is called Grave Creek Mound. Located in Moundsville, this burial mound is 62 feet high and 250 feet in diameter. Other prehistoric people. The descendants of the Adena people continued to live on the land, but the evidence they left was not as obvious. Some archaeologists study how the mound builders slowly changed their way of life. Over the next 1,000 years, the people who inhabited the land of West Virginia adapted. By the 1600s, they lived in small villages along the river valleys. It is believed that they abandoned these villages due to the Iroquois attacks during the mid-1600s. Native Americans. In the 1700s, when early European settlers arrived, several Native American tribes were using the region as hunting grounds. Conflicts between the settlers, now laying claim to the land, and the tribes who used the land periodically were inevitable. From the 1750s to the 1790s, these conflicts, known as the Indian Wars, marked violent native resistance to Euro-American occupation. The building of frontier forts was a defensive strategy that established a span of forts to be built across West Virginia. French and Indian War. During this conflict, settlers in the upper New River and Greenbrier valleys were captured, killed, or frightened back across the mountains, while settlements in the South Branch and Potomac valleys were met with heavy assault. A chain of forts organized by George Washington helped a minority of residents hold their ground. Dunmore's War, 1774. Fought in 1774 between Shawnee, led by Cornstalk, and Virginians, led by Andrew Lewis, there was only one major engagement of Dunmore's War. This conflict is known as the Battle of Point Pleasant and is one of the most important battles ever fought in West Virginia. Cornstalk lost this battle and helped negotiate the Treaty of Camp Charlotte. Lord Dunmore was the last colonial governor of Virginia. This conflict pacified the Native Americans in the Ohio Valley during the first 2 years of the Revolutionary War. And finally, the Revolutionary War from 1775 to 1783. This conflict was similar to the French and Indian War in West Virginia, where Native American raids against the settlers in their forts and homes were prevalent. While British authorities supplied and encouraged Native Americans, raiding parties often acted alone, attacking forts and picking off isolated families. British elements served in advising Native warriors in some of the larger attacks. West Virginians were integral in helping to supply important war materials such as wagons, clothing, and food. Now that we have learned about the 5 periods of time, you can now work on the timeline. Remember, you can use the information that we just read to help complete the timeline. Let's do the first one together. Number 1 on the timeline has a range from 500 BC to 200 BC. Remember that events that happened before 0 AD work like negative numbers on a number line and get bigger the further you go from 0. After looking at the labels from the timeline, it appears that mound builders lived in our area from 500 BC to 200 BC. So write mound builders in the number 1 bracket. Use the period names above the timeline to label the remaining brackets in the timeline.